Welcome back to the Triple Threat Podcast. My name is William Ezel, and today we are continuing our record predictions with the NFC. I'm recording this at 10 o'clock on Sunday, so this is before the first round of games, just to make sure that we're clear that even if these get out after one, which I'm planning on them not happening, but even if that does, we will be fine. So let's start off the NFC with the NFC North. And this division can go a lot of ways. These teams are very evenly split talent-wise. But what's really going to be valuable, and you'll see throughout my predictions, is going to be cohesion, because during this coronavirus season, teams with the shortened offseason, I trust the teams that have been together, have stuck together, have a core rotation, chemistry, and experience will be the ones that probably do the best out of these groups. So I'm really going to be using that a lot for my predictions. And we'll start in last place with the Chicago Bears. So if you look at the Bears roster as a whole, it's decent. They've got a great defense, obviously. They have Khalil Mack, Keem Hicks. They brought in some good players in the offseason. If you look at their offseason, it's pretty good. They brought in Barkevius Mingo. They brought in Robert Quinn, who's their big addition because he looked great as a speed rusher at Dallas last year and probably will do wonders again this year. 10 sacks maybe. Jimmy Graham's a little bit of an interesting addition. Demetrius Harris is a good blocking tight end. So that was only their addition. They brought in Artie Burns as well, who I don't know if had any impact on this team. They lost Hockley and Dix. They lost Leonard Floyd. So those are two big losses for them. And they also have guys like Prince Mukamara and Taylor Gabriel, who have also been lost but still have claimed yet. So this really comes down to one position and one position alone, and that's quarterback. And with the weapons around him, I really just don't trust Mr. Trubisky to have an optimal setup. You look at the offensive line, they still have Leonard, they still have Macy at tackles, they still have Daniels and Whitehair in the middle. So their offensive line, they're going to have some cohesion there. That'll be fine. They will still be an average group as they were the past couple of years. Tight end situation should be very interesting because they have so many of them. They have Cole Kmet, they have Graham, who I said, they have Harris, as I mentioned. They have a lot of options at tight end. At one point, they had 10 tight ends on the roster, so that's going to be interesting to see. Their receiving options look all right. They got Allen Robinson, he's a beast. He's played really well the past couple of years, even with limited quarterback play. They've had good, and then they've got Anthony Miller, who's been a little bit of a disappointment out of Memphis, and they've brought in Ted King Jr. Cornerbacks spots are a little bit interesting. Will Fuller had a down year last year. He had a grade of 62.5 on PFF from his previous 81.4. His coverage grade was down to 58, which, if you don't know the PFF rating system, that's around about average. And then we look at their defensive metrics. So I'm using Football Outsiders for this, but their weighted score on defense. And last season, the Bears ranked. It wasn't an incredible season for them. It was definitely a step back from what they had the year before. So Chicago was ranked 10th compared to their last year's first place at defensive DVOA, and that's just adjusted value over replacement or above average. So how much better they did versus an average defense. And last year it was only 5% better. Their weighted defense, however, where they were 10th as well, 11th against the pass, 10th against the rush. I think Khalil Mack will have a better year than he did last year. He's going to be motivated. As his coaches say, he hates being forgot. And there's no way this guy has that much talent. He's not going to be forgotten. I think he'll step it back up. But overall, I have him going 4-12 because I look at this roster and they haven't strengthened like the other teams in the division have. They have a stagnant quarterback play who relies on a lot of system-designed short throws. When you rely on Mitch Trubisky to make decision-making by himself, he's been very, very poor. And that's been shown in the turnover differential because you look at the Chicago Bears and they don't really have any metric going for them. So Chicago had a turnover differential of 0 last year. They only had 19 takeaways, which was really low for this defense, apparently, from what they had last year, only 19 takeaways. So Trubisky just wasn't really doing anything on offense. I don't know at what point will Nick Foles take over if they're struggling as much as I think they will. But I think it might be another Jacksonville type year for Nick Foles. Not a great roster around him. I just can't see their secondary. They brought in Tayshaun Gibson at safety. I don't think that's going to be a great signing. Roquan and Trevathan have been pretty average the last 2 years, and then Buster Skrine in the slot's not great. Let's look at their draft real quick, because their draft was bad. So they brought in Cole Kmet in the second round, which is a little bit of a reach for me. My tight end one was Adam Trautman. So one, trying to take a tight end this early for a team that did not need tight end was a bit of a reach. Jalen Johnson was a great pick out of Utah. He was my quarterback 7, I believe. I think that was an A- pick by them. And then Darnell Mooney is a pretty interesting pick by Tulane, but that's really their only notable picks. So they didn't strengthen this roster at all. And I think they'll be a little bit complacent. You look at their strength of schedule this year, and the Bears rank tied third easiest. But I still just don't think this roster, and it's not the roster. It's really the pieces and the motivation, the system around it. I just don't think this has a very good chance of success, especially with the other teams in the division. And we'll start with that. We'll go to the next team. We have the Detroit Lions going 5-11. And I admit this is a little bit hard for this roster, but still, I'm not the biggest Matt Patricia believer. And then it's really the defense where you're going to be looking at issues on this team. So you have the linebacking core. Gerard Davis played terribly last year. He had a defensive grade of 38, which is a PFF system is incredibly low. Jelani Tavai was not great at linebacker as well. They brought in Landon Collins, and when he was at the Browns, he did not play well. His 2 years out of New England, he had grades. He had his 2 worst years ever, and I don't know if Matt Patricia's going to be able to bring New England to Detroit. They lost a lot of defensive line pieces. So if you go to their off season, they lost Mike Daniels. They picked him free agency. They lost Damon Harrison. They lost Ashawn Robinson. They lost Devon Kennard. They lost Grant Glasgow. They lost Rick Wagner. They lost a lot of key pieces on their front, their defensive and offensive lines. And I think that's going to be a really big issue for them. They brought in Danny Shell, another former Patriot. They brought in Trufant, who was not good for the Falcons the past 2 years. They brought in Geronimo Allison. They paid a lot of money to Holly Puvaitai. And then they brought in Reggie Ragland. So I didn't see too much big additions to this team. Their biggest addition is going to be Matthew Stafford being healthy. So you're really going to be looking at guys. The really concern is if Tyrell Crosby is going to be able to hold up as right tackle. And then they also have Joel Dahl at left guard. So offensive line has 3 good pieces in Decker, Ragnow, and Jonah Jackson, who they drafted. And I'll get into the draft in a second, but they didn't do much to strengthen, and I just don't have faith in this coaching staff or in this, and especially if Kenny Galladay's going to be not fully healthy. This receiving core is a little bit depleted then, because he's a really good player, and if they miss him, it's going to be really difficult for them. So Detroit have it's not as easy as the Bears schedule is, obviously, but they're 7th easiest, so a little bit more difficult than the Bears, but it's a relatively easy schedule, all things considered. But if you look at this roster, the linebacking core is really weak. They have a lot of new pieces. I just don't think that they're going to be able to really compete, especially if they're having Marvin Jones Jr. and Mendola as their starting 2 receivers. And then they brought in Marvin Hall. So I really is not fully convinced. You look at their defensive metrics from last season, and it's not really what you'd expect from Matt Patricia defense, ranked 23rd overall, 28th against the pass, and that's with Darius Slay. I see Jeff Okudah as a upgrade, but as a year 1 cornerback, he's going to be targeted by teams like Aaron Rodgers, because Aaron Rodgers always is notorious for targeting young receivers. And then they were 16th against the rush. So their passing defense wasn't great last year. They lost some pieces on that secondary. They lost Quandre Diggs, obviously, in the middle of last season. So their safeties right now are Tracy Walker and Teron Harmon. So they're 2 pretty average safeties. I expect them to be able to get the job done, but I just worry about Deshaun Hand and Julian Akwara or Romeo Akwara in the middle of the defensive line. I think that running game should be really weak. They have Danny Sheldon obviously as well and Nick Williams, but no one on that defensive line is really special. I don't see any real difference makers on that interior. So you're really hoping and banking your production is going to be on Trey Flowers. So that's not really a key to success. And then their draft it was pretty average. So Jeff Okudah was a good pick. I I think that was probably the safest pick they could make. I think Isaiah Sims would have been really interesting in a Patricia defense. They brought in DeAndre Swift, who I think is overrated, extremely overrated. I didn't even have him in my. I think I was like my running back 7 or 8. Really was not a fan of him. I think he does a lot of things average. Doesn't really break the game in any one facet. Hopefully AP can teach him some stuff. Julian Akwara is a good. I think Julian Akwara is a really good pickup. I think he probably will start over the other Akwara pretty soon. Josh Piassini out of Utah is a good run stuffer, so maybe he can start. Joe Jackson was a great pick at 75. And then Quentin Cephas is a decent receiver that can come in maybe as a receiver number 4 this year. But overall, not a very inspiring team. And you're going to be really relying on Matt Stafford and hoping he can pull some miracles off. And I'm not so sure about that. So moving on, we have 2 playoff teams. And you already know who they are, the Green Bay Packers and Minnesota Vikings. The only question now is the order. So I have the Green Bay Packers finishing 9-7, finishing 3rd in the division. So with the Green Bay Packers, your big concern with them is defensive line, the interior of the defensive line, because it's Kenny Clark and no one else. And Kenny Clark is what he does great is rush the passer. He's a great pass rushing D tackle. He's not as great against the run, but he's capable. And then you look at their other guys that they're going to try to play defensive tackle. You have guys like Tyler Lancaster, who is terrible against the run. Well, not terrible, but he's bad. And you got Dean Lowry as well. So that's what the 49ers really took advantage of last season. And that's really going to be their issue again this year as well. You look at their linebacker core, very weak as well. Or Burks, if they're going into base personnel, they're going to have Burks and Christian Kirksey, who they brought in. Not the most inspiring linebacking core. And I think that teams like the Vikings, who run a lot of 12 personnel, Irv Smith, Kyle Rudolph will be able to take advantage of that middle of the field. And they have one really good corner, and Jair Alexander, Kevin King is a decent secondary option, but he's not anything special. Donald Savage and Amos are a great safety tandem. You're going to really want to hope to see more out of Jay Sternberger as a second-year player. I think that he really can step up and fill the role. You're going to be banking on Alan Lazard taking a step up this year as well, or maybe Equanimeous St. Brown, or pretty much anyone else they have. Maybe Marquez Valdes-Scantling, but you're really relying on some young receivers developing, which isn't the key to success. They lost Bulaga, replaced with Rick Wagner. Not the most impressive right tackle replacement, but he's capable. Their offensive line still decent. I expect Elton Jenkins to be great again this year. I expect Corey Linsley and Bakhtiari to still be good. You're really going to have – I think Aaron Jones is going to lose some production this year. He's going to lose some touches to guys like Jamal Williams, who apparently came to shape as a whole different player, and then A.J. Dillon, who they drafted. I still expect the Smith brothers to be great again. Preston and Za'Darius were awesome last year. I don't think Za'Darius will live up to the grade he set last year because he was the 3rd best graded defensive end or right outside linebacker last season. And I don't think that's going to be able to continue. I think he'll step back down to maybe where he was playing at Baltimore. But he's still going to be a great player. And then they didn't really strengthen much in the offseason or the draft. So if you look at their offseason moves, they brought in Kirksey, they brought in Funches, who opted out. They brought in Wagner, and that's pretty much it. They lost Blake Martinez, which isn't a big loss. They lost Brad Bulaga, which was a pretty big loss. They lost Kyler Fackrell, Jimmy Grant from Allison, but nothing really too important. And then we look at their draft, and this is really where people really were confused, is what they were doing here. Jordan Love, I was a big fan of Jordan Love. I wouldn't really believe or buy too much into the bad camp buzz he's been getting because Drew Lock, a lot of rookie quarterbacks are going to have a good camp. And then I don't expect rookie to take over immediately. I want to see what are the reviews out of the coaching staff at the end of the year. If I'm getting good reviews, then I'd be really confident as a Green Bay fan. But it's not a very it's a forward-thinking pick, but when you have Aaron Rodgers, I wouldn't be thinking too forward. And if you're in a championship window, I'd try to optimize that instead of trying to build for a better future. So that was a little bit of an interesting pick. He's going to be and they traded up for him too, so it's going to be interesting how they use him. Well, they won't this year, but it'll be interesting how they manage Rodgers' contract going forward. And I think that they really should have tried to strengthen around him, try to maybe bring in Josh Jones at right tackle would have been a really good signing. Maybe even draft a guy like any of their linebackers that are available at that point. They could have had some pretty decent options there. Jordan Brooks, who Seattle took, so they could have had some good options there at linebacker for who they needed. I think Brooks would have been a great fit there. It's a great against the run. So a little bit of a for a couple years down the line pick. And then they got AJ Dillon, who I was really high on before the season, a little bit lower on after the season, the college season. But he really is a great power downhill running back. But when you have a running back stable like this full, you're probably going to be looking at this pick and trying to push Aaron Jones out the door last year of his contract. So they want to go more power run. They drafted like 5 interior offensive linemen in the draft. Then they drafted in the third round Joseph DeGoya out of Cincinnati, who they're probably going to put at fullback. So they were really trying to embrace power run. And I don't really get that. I think this is Matt LaFleur trying to put his stamp on the offense too soon. I think you have to play with the cards that you're dealt, and you have a passing attack. You have Aaron Rodgers. You have Devontae Adams. I'd be trying to maximize that aspect and asset of your facet of your offense instead of trying to create something new. So I think these picks lack direction, and then they drafted John Runyon as a decent guard. Maybe we'll be able to replace um, Taylor this season, but not sure about that. Their strength of schedule is it's all right. It's tied 16th middle of the pack. Their defensive metrics last year, they were 15th overall, 9th against the pass, and 29th against the 27th against the run. I expect that run defense grade to be incredibly poor as well this year. They won a lot of one-score games last year. I think they were 6-1 or 7-1 against in one-score games last year. And typically, when you see teams with such an outlier in that one-score game win-loss chart, they typically regress a little bit the next year. Thanks, Lefko, for that stat, and Warren Sharp. Gotta respect that. So Green Bay, it's a solid roster again this year. They've got a great quarterback. They should be able to make the playoffs again with this roster, but I wouldn't be too terribly surprised if they didn't. Their Vegas win total this year is going to be set right at 8.5. So I had about the over, but I'd probably stay away from that one if I were you. Their offensive metrics were a little bit interesting as well last year. So Green Bay ranked 8th overall, 10th in the pass, 4th in the rush. They really were great in the run game last season, so I don't really know why they tried to draft the two specifically last year in the draft. So a little bit of an interesting season. So that brings us to our division champions, the 10-6 Minnesota Vikings. This roster is really good on defense. I worry about their interior line a little bit after losing Linval Joseph. So you're going to be looking at guys like Jaleel Johnson stepping up and Shamar Stevens they brought back last year. So a little bit questionable there. I expect their interior to be a little bit suspect, but their secondary is still incredible. I mean, their safeties are at least. You have Harrison Smith and their franchise tag Anthony Harris. Anthony Harris was probably one of the best safeties last year, if not the best safety last year. I expect Mike Hughes to take a big leap. I saw a lot of potential out of him last season, and I really expect him to take a big leap this year. They brought in, they have Holton Hill, and they brought in a lot of good talent in the draft. So let's start with their draft because I think their draft was incredible. Justin Jefferson, the first round, was an A-plus pick. He was my receiver number 2. I think after the loss of Stephon Diggs, they got an adequate replacement immediately. Jeff Gladney, I think he was my cornerback 3. Bring him in. I think he's going to be the number 2 cornerback from day one. He might even be the number 1 cornerback pretty soon. I really like his man coverage ability. I think he's a really sticky corner. I think he's going to be great in man-to-man coverage. I think he can do great things. As for Cleveland, I think is a really good value at pick 58. I wasn't as high on him as a lot of people were. People were thinking he was a late first-round pick. I didn't see that. You guys have guys like Cam Dantzler, who was really good in man coverage, played really effectively against Jamar Chase, but his speed is a little bit suspect. He's got good length. I really hope Mike Zimmer can get a lot out of him. I think he can be a really good slot corner pretty soon. Mikael Walker of Fresno State's a pretty interesting pick. So, a little interesting there. You got James Lynch out of Baylor. I think he probably will start D tackle pretty soon. I think Lynch is someone who's going to come in and be really good in the pass game and pretty decent in the run game. Troy Dye at Oregon. I think he can probably replace either Eric Wilson or Anthony Barr pretty soon in coverage because I think Troy Dye is a really handy cover linebacker. And then you have guys like Kenny Willix, who's a really, really promising defensive end. And with that injury to Danielle Hunter, I think Kenny Willix can step in pretty adequately. I think he's going to be a pretty decent player, kind of like a Max Crosby last year, but not as productive as he was. With the Vikings, you're really going to worry about the interior offensive line. You have Dakota Dozier and Pat Eiflin as your two guards. I want to see a big step up from Garrett Bradbury this year. I really liked him coming out as a center prospect, but he was very poor in the pass game last season. I'd expect that to improve this season. Reef and O'Neal played solid at tackle last year, really stepped up their performance. I think that they're going to be running a lot of 12 personnel again this year. So I really expect Irv Smith to take another big step this season. I think that they won't lose anything after their offensive coordinator went to Cleveland, because if you think about it, I don't think he was not a good coach. I think Kevin Stefanski was a very, very subpar offensive coordinator. I think he mismanaged the team. I think when you look at that coaching staff, it's really interesting because Minnesota, it's going to be Gary Kubiak, because Gary Kubiak was really the mastermind of offense last year, and you could really see that through their run plays, their zone run scheme. You could tell that was a Kubiak system in place, not a system in place by their previous coach. So I think that they're not going to lose anything with Stefanski leaving. I didn't think Stefanski was a very good coach. I thought he was quite overrated. Their offseason move was very interesting. They brought in Yannick Ngakoue for a second-round pick in a trade that was not too long ago. Franchise tag Anthony Harris, which is a good move. They brought in Michael Pierce, but he opted out, so that's going to be a big loss for them. I was really hoping that'd be a great addition. Tajay Sharp's a pretty decent pickup at wide receiver. I thought that'd be a pretty handy signing right there. So I was really hoping Michael Pierce would play for them, because that would have been a great pickup for them, because they lost Linval Joseph, obviously. Their strength of schedule is a little bit harder because, they play the second ranked schedule because of their placing last season. So Minnesota will rank. Actually, they have a very favorable schedule. So Minnesota ranked 14th, 30th in the division. I really think this roster is pretty complete. The defensive metrics last year were solid. They were 4th overall, 5th against the pass, 12th against the rush. I expect that rush to go a little bit down because of the loss of Linval Joseph and the opting on Michael Pierce. So their secondary still be rock solid, and their weighted defense was 6th, so they played well down the stretch as well last season. They even put Danielle Hunter at tackle, because that's what they did against the Saints to generate more pressure at the middle to get in Breeze's face and disrupt him. So they can dial up some creative stuff, and they can do game plan specific defenses, which is really something important for them. You look at their offense; they were pretty middle of the road, 11th and 10th overall, so pretty solid there. With a healthy Dalvin Cook for the whole year and a contracted Dalvin Cook, I expect them to do well. So this Minnesota team is really just the best in the division, talent-wise, roster-wise, experience-wise. I think Kirk Cousins is going to play really well this year. He played well last year, and I see no reason why he can't continue that pattern. So I'm really interested to see how this team does, because they've got a lot of elite players on this roster, and I really hope they can step it up. My only concern is they have Thielen and Jefferson, who both want to play slot. So I don't know. One of them's going to have to suffice and play outside. Probably going to be Thielen. So I might have a little bit of a down year after that, because if you look at his snap count last season, he played 155 snaps in the slot, but he did play a lot outside. So not too much of a decline for him, but I really want to see Jefferson in the slot. This team's really the best in the division roster wise, and in a year like this, they're really gonna benefit from that. So that'll do it for the NFC North. I'm gonna try to get out these other divisions really soon. Try to get this episode out before 1, but if not, I've recorded this before the first game, so I don't think there's really too much I can do about that. So take care and watch other videos.